Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the final lecture of this term's series. It's wonderful that we've had a fabulous turnout for this, so thank you for joining us today. My name's Sophie Schermacher, and I'm the Alumni Relations Officer at Green Templeton. I've just got one or two bits of housekeeping to go through. Everyone is muted during the event, but we will be holding a Q&A at the end of Meera's talk. So please put your questions into the chat box and we'll go through as many of them as we can. We'll do our best to cover them all. The lecture will be recorded and you will all be sent a link later in the week, so you can access not only this lecture, but the previous lectures that have taken place this term. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce Meera Selva. Meera is the Deputy Director of the Reuters Institute and Director of the Journalist Fellowship Programme. She's an accomplished senior journalist with experience in Europe, Asia and Africa. Before joining the Reuters Institute, she was editor of the English language Handelsblatt Global, a title she helped launch in Berlin in 2014. Before that, she had worked at a range of other news organisations, including the Associated Press, the Daily Telegraph and The Independent, both in the UK and internationally, including 3 years as Africa correspondent based in Nairobi. The title of Meera's talk today is Press Freedom in a Pandemic. Over to you, Meera.
Thank you, everybody, and welcome. I'm going to end this slideshow because I just had this one slide as an introduction. That's me. Hi, and thank you so much for joining. I'm Meera Selva, and thank you, Sophie, for that introduction. I run the Journalism Fellowship Programme over at 13 Norham Gardens. We're part of Green Templeton College, and I'm really pleased to speak to you all today, and I'm especially pleased to have with me many of the journalist fellows on the programme. There are 13 of them at the fellowship at the moment. They flew into England just before lockdown and are now basically locked down in little bedrooms all around Oxford, but we are carrying on the fellowship digitally. I'm incredibly grateful for them for having made the effort and for having got here, and for GTC for having continued to host them, because what is very clear is that the issue of press freedom and the future of journalism is incredibly pertinent, more pertinent now than ever, when we're all kind of sat in these screens in our homes, unable to go outside, unable to speak, unable to gossip with people, unable to get a sense of what's going on in the street, literally sometimes. The media is one of the very few outlets that are still our kind of connection to the outside world. And yet at the same time, there's a whole set of circumstances, which I'll go through today, why this is under attack. In quite a severe way. And it's kind of important that everybody understands both the importance of journalism and the perilous state it's in at the moment. I don't have slides and I won't actually talk for that long because I would like this to be a discussion and a Q&A. So do please put in points you want to raise from the chat all the way through, and I'll bring them into the chat, into my talk while I can, if I can, and if not, I'll answer any questions at the end. I mean, we all know that a free press is needed to provide the flow of information across society, and in particular to look at how, sorry, I'm just going to look at my notes. We all know that it's needed to provide the free flow of information across society, and also to hold the powerful to account, and also to tell the stories of those who may not otherwise be heard. A free press also paints a picture of who we are as a society and defines us, and in many ways defines the national conversation. But it is also very much under attack. I can talk about general statistics. I can talk about how the Committee to Protect Journalists counts that 274 journalists were imprisoned last year. Many of them were Chinese reporters and bloggers who'd been reporting on COVID-19 out of Wuhan and other areas. 32 journalists were killed, some by crossfire or in war zones, but many were deliberately targeted and murdered, either for or as a direct result of their work. And the case of Jamal Khashoggi, the journalist for the Washington Post, murdered on the orders of the Saudi government while visiting a consulate in Turkey, is terrifying, gruesome, and a warning of just how bad things can get when governments think they can act with impunity. But I want to bring this much closer to home, because journalism is under attack not just in dictatorships and war zones, but in countries where you really can expect more. And the nature of this attack is on personal journalists as individuals. So it's partly for their work, and it's partly because where they go to. If you go and cover the yellow vest protests in France as a journalist, you are under threat, but sometimes you're under threat simply for who you are. And this is especially true for women and for journalists of color and from other minorities in Britain and many other countries. Early results on one study by UNESCO and a journalist organization show that some 73% of women journalists have experienced online violence in the course of their work. And this violence comes in the form of rape threats, coordinated abuse, and invasions of privacy, publishing details of your home address, publishing photos of you, often transposing your head onto pornographic videos, deeply unpleasant things that might not immediately have a physical impact on you, can have a real psychological impact on you and your career and that of your family. So I want to look a bit more at how we got here, and in particular, how the pandemic has hit journalism and the concept of press freedom. Press freedom can be chipped away at in many different ways. And by the time the situation becomes critical, it's too late. India, Mexico, and Turkey are all democracies that have managed in their histories to develop pluralistic political systems and conduct credible elections and peaceful transitions of power. But they're now amongst the worst countries in the world to be a journalist. Turkey, once seen as a model for other Muslim countries, is now the world's worst jailer of journalists. India, the world's largest democracy, has become an incredibly dangerous place to be a journalist. At least 12 journalists have been killed there since 2017 that we know about, including 3 killed in hit and run car crashes in 24 hours in 2018. And other journalists there, both men and women, face huge levels of online abuse, physical attack and harassment, often encouraged by local leaders, local politicians, and cases where the police either actively participate or turn a blind eye to these attacks. And in Mexico, drug cartels have assassinated investigative journalists at such a rate that it's now the most dangerous country by far outside conflict zones to be a journalist. Each of these countries has had first-rate, independent, high-minded, principled journalists who are excellent at their jobs. But these journalists and their media houses have not always been so good at selling their case to the public, at clearly articulating the value and purpose of journalism, or at showing solidarity with their colleagues at rival outlets when they come in under attack. And this matters absolutely everywhere. In Europe, which should be, and you'd think is one of the safest continents in the world for press freedom, 3 journalists have been murdered in the last 3 years. Daphne Caruana Galizia in Malta, Jan Kuciak in Slovakia, and Victoria Marinova in Bulgaria. All 3 of them had reported on organized crime and corruptions. And these deaths did not happen in a vacuum. They happened in a climate where many journalists have been attacked and undermined and discredited by politicians, where the media have been captured or financially weakened, and where lawsuits have been used to systematically hamper and inhibit the pursuit of investigative independent journalism. And some of the most pernicious attacks on independent journalism come from other journalists, often working for state-controlled media, but not always. And this polarization within the profession has pushed many journalists into silos they do not want to be in and deepened this sense of being under siege. And you see this everywhere. If you work for a kind of publication that's associated with the center-right, you can often come under quite vicious attack from journalists who work at publications on the center-left, and again, the other way around. And so journalism, instead of being a profession where you can move from one publication to another and build your career, becomes a place where you have to state your identity, you have to pick a side, and you pretty much have to stick to it for your whole career. It takes away from the notions of impartiality and balance and the idea that journalists are somehow neutral observers above the fray. It makes them very much part of the fray, and in turn, that puts someone in danger. The words of politicians really matter here as well. I talked about Jan Kuciak in Slovakia. In November 2016, 15 months before he was murdered, the Prime Minister at the time, Robert Fico, really lashed out at journalists who had questioned him about allegations that public procurement rules had been broken during the country's EU presidency. Speaking to a group of local reporters, he said, "Some of you are dirty, anti-Slovak prostitutes. You don't inform, you fight with the government." This term, prostitutes, is something that we also hear a great deal in India. It's again conflating this kind of sexual attack on journalists who are simply doing their job. 15 months later, Jan Kuciak was killed while investigating public procurement and possible links with the mafia in Italy. And while Italian journalists are well aware of the threats they face if they do go to investigate organized crime and corruption, this was the first time a journalist had been killed in Slovakia, and the Slovakian people were utterly outraged and dismayed. And this year, journalism has come under a new and incredible sustained level of attack. There have been new restrictions on press freedom Many of them have been imposed in connection with the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, and they have definitely made it harder for journalists to independently report the news. It was not inevitable that the onset of a pandemic should have resulted in an assault in the press. In a public health emergency, most authorities accept that it's vital to communicate with the public hungry for information. And while the most effective way of doing that can be via the broadcast media and the news media, it's seen as a way to get your message out very, very quickly. And yes, when COVID-19 first began to spread in the springtime last year, which now feels an era away, people did turn to the media. We collected data in late March and early April at the Reuters Institute in 6 countries: Argentina, Britain, Germany, South Korea, Spain, and the United States. And we showed that news consumption very definitely surged in the early days as people went online or turned to their television to get information about the crisis. And they tended to turn to the trusted sources. They tended to turn to the public sector broadcasters, to the big names that they knew best. And that's what the governments also worked with. They kind of knew that the legacy media, the kind of traditional names, were the best way to get the message out at the time. But as the pandemic spread, many authorities around the world began to crack down on journalists. And this coincided with a loss of interest in news about the pandemic too. People obeyed the rules and they wanted to know the rules, but they basically got bored of reading about it. There's a situation that has both not changed for a year and has also been the only news story in town. It's a tremendously difficult situation in which to be a journalist and in which to be a news editor. What are your stories that you pick? Nobody's lives are going on as normal. And yet the thing that occupies all our minds, affects our families, affects our finances, is an ongoing, unchanging situation. It's a really difficult daily news story. But journalism was already in crisis going into the pandemic. The reasons are a familiar mix of plummeting subscriptions and advertising revenues, competition from social media and other online information sources, and a breakdown of trust in the media, combined with an explosion of competing narratives from both quality newcomers and bad faith actors peddling misinformation. All this got much worse in the last year. And if there was little money for journalism before, there's even less of it now. And this makes journalism more vulnerable, less able to withstand attack. So what I want to do now is just outline some of the ways the pandemic in particular has hit journalism and the free press and the ability of journalists to report. The first thing I can see very clearly is nationalism. Each country is focused on securing its borders, counting death rates within its borders, and comparing death rates, lockdown times, vaccination rollouts to that of other countries. An ability to cope with the outbreak has in many cases become a case of national pride, and critical reporting has therefore been seen as unhelpful for morale. It's almost kind of a wartime mentality. You saw this very, very early on. In India, the Prime Minister Narendra Modi first tried to have the country's highest court compel media to publish only official accounts of the pandemic. He failed in the courts, but he then wrote very simply to leading editors, asking them to refrain from publishing negative stories, and many of them did. And in Serbia, a journalist, Anna Lalik, was detained for spreading panic and unrest when she wrote about the shortages of personal protective equipment at a local health centre. This has become even more ridiculous with the rollout of the vaccines program, where European leaders have engaged in a quite unedifying and public spat over vaccine rollout and access, which again has made it incredibly hard as a journalist writing for a national publication or a broadcaster for a national broadcaster to kind of give a true overview of what's going on without a sense of nationalism and jingoistic pride coming into this. And I can't really stop that without kind of talking about China, which has been one of the worst countries this year in terms of jailing journalists. One of the earliest cases of press freedom, suppression of journalism related to the pandemic came out of Wuhan, where the Chinese citizen journalist Chen Qishi, who had been reporting about the new disease while official channels were still suppressing vital information, disappeared in February. After having been detained by authorities, he re-emerged in September, only in September. And Zhang Zhen, another citizen journalist arrested in May for picking quarrels and provoking trouble, has been sentenced to 4 years in jail. There has also been a tendency that I think we all recognize to brand critical reporting as fake news and in turn discredit independent news and encourage people to harass reporters both online and in real life. We've seen this in the United States with the former President Donald Trump, who very directly attacked both certain news outlets, but also individual journalists. And I was on a Zoom call with a senior editor of one of the most respected US publications the other day. And he spoke in a way that utterly terrified me about how personal details have been published online, and he expects there to be a mass killing of journalists in the US at some point soon because of this air of turning on journalism that has been propagated at all levels. There's also concerns over the types of laws that the pandemic has led to. Concerns over misinformation and how to fight it have led in turn to new laws to address the problems that can be very easily turned on the media. So the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán was one of the first to use this pandemic in this way. In late March, he changed the country's criminal code to threaten up to 5 years of prison time for anyone deemed to be hampering the virus fight by distorting facts. Other countries quickly followed suit, and the International Press Institute counted 17 countries worldwide that had passed new laws against fake news in 2020. This list includes Brazil, the Philippines, Hungary, and Russia. These are all countries whose leaders have a previous record of systematically undermining and dismantling journalism, and the fact that they're also on this list is no coincidence. And in many cases, governments have just not needed to use the actual laws to stifle critical reporting. Merely passing them has had the chilling effect on journalists, deterring them from reporting anything that strays from the official government line. Because if you bear in mind what I said earlier, that most media organizations are struggling financially, you have to have a very strong stomach indeed to report on a story that you know is going to end up with you having to fight a case in court, possibly a protracted, expensive case that you don't have the funds to sustain. And the very nature of the pandemic, the lockdowns, the shutdown of public gatherings and spaces, and the move of much activity and communication online has raised new challenges for journalists trying to gather information, access sources, and report on their stories. It also gave the politicians who wanted to control the media new tools to do so. In various ways, COVID-19 has made it much easier for governments to restrict the dissemination of uncomfortable information or simply to withhold it. Press conferences, remember those noisy, crowded rooms where reporters jostled with each other to shout questions at politicians and at their spokesmen and spokeswomen? They've been replaced with online question and answer sessions where it's much easier to exclude critical journalists and pre-select friendly questions. In many countries, officials have also used the pandemic as an excuse to suspend requests for freedom of information under government transparency laws, or to scrap legally mandated deadlines to respond to them. The pandemic has also given rise to a new type of licensing of journalists, even in countries where you were basically considered a journalist if you could pick up a notebook and go and get a story and get it published. And the idea of having a state license, the state giving you a license to be a journalist, is an abhorrent one. And this has been weaponized in very clear ways. In the Philippines, the president's office banned all journalists from traveling to areas in lockdown without a specific identification card issued by his own personal communications office. Several media organizations did apply, but the process was incredibly slow. The system was unable to cope, so only a few passes were issued in the early days. And also they apply only to individual reporters. So if these reporters themselves fall sick or have to self-quarantine, a colleague will not be able to take their place. So you restrict which journalists can go somewhere, and you make damn sure that that journalist can't pass the story on to another colleague, which is what would be the normal thing that would happen in any organization, really. Governments have also weaponized press accreditation to expel foreign journalists. China revoked the press passes of several foreign correspondents working for US newspapers in Beijing and expelled them from the country. Egyptian authorities revoked the press pass of Ruth Michelson from The Guardian after she reported on a study that said Egypt probably had more cases of COVID-19 than official figures suggested. Several authorities have also taken steps that prevent journalists accessing the information they need to report on the news. In many cases, this includes clampdowns on possible whistleblowers. Again, going back to China, Dr. Li Wenliang, the Chinese doctor who sounded an early warning about COVID-19, was detained in December for spreading false rumors and forced to sign a police document admitting he'd breached the law, only to be officially exonerated after he died from the virus. This kind of treatment of doctors and nurses and medical staff, the people who have access to the front line of the pandemic, as threats to national security and people who should not be allowed to speak to the journalists, has meant, again, this kind of flow of information in society has been quite severely stymied. And then there's just the simple fact that you can use lockdown laws to stop journalists being on the street at all. So in South Africa, there's an editor of community newspaper, Mohokare News, Paul Ntoba, who was assaulted by police in May as he was photographing them on patrol enforcing lockdown regulations. And after the assault, he fled to Lesotho. And this was the first time in post-apartheid South Africa that a journalist had fled the country, fearing for his safety. Again, a sense of the fact that we seem to be going backwards in this area, not forward. In the UK, again, keeping it home, in the early days, the Doctors Association found evidence that doctors and nurses in the country's public hospitals were being told by their management not to speak out about shortages in personal protective equipment at a time when there was a severe shortage in the country. The wider story of this year has been the relationship between the public and the media. At the start of the pandemic, interest in news and trust in media were relatively high. But as the pandemic progressed, this trust fell away. Journalists were once more seen as taking sides in increasingly polarized societies rather than remaining impartial observers. Journalists were once more accused of being part of the establishment elite and not to be trusted. And this has really manifests itself in the way that in public demonstrations, crowds have often turned on journalists reporting on the protests. This was the case in many anti-lockdown protests in Western countries, where journalists were not generally targeted in the past. So in Germany, a camera crew from the public broadcaster were attacked while filming at an anti-lockdown demonstration in May. And in Slovenia, again, a very, very peaceful country, on November the 5th, the photojournalist Borut Zivolovic, sorry for my pronunciation, was knocked unconscious while taking photos in the Republic Square in central Ljubljana. That's the site of weekly protests against the government. He woke up hours later in hospital to hear that several other journalists had also been attacked by an unknown assailants that same night. Slovenia is not previously known for violence against journalists, but again, it's now a country where the Prime Minister and senior officials are routinely attack the press. Sorry. This is speaking, nothing else. Journalists face the biggest risks, basically, when there is a sense that they will not be protected by the authorities. So in Mexico, there's photojournalist Jaime Castaño Zacarias, who was killed after taking photographs of dead bodies. He came across on the side of the road shortly after a clash between rival drug cartels. Organized crime cartels treat the media as the enemy in Mexico, an enemy to be vanquished, and they get away with it. The killers are rarely found, prosecutions are rarely brought to court. Government disrespect for the independent media paves the way for these kind of attacks. And the more the authorities attack and undermine journalists and journalism, the more militants, criminal gangs, extremists, and agitators feel that they too can attack journalists with impunity. Now, I said I want to keep this close to home, so I just want to kind of end with an anecdote. And I know this isn't in the same league as some of the kind of horrific threats and attacks I've been speaking about, but it's recent and it's important. In the UK, there are really worrying signs of the debate going in this direction. Last month, the UK government put out a really nicely done video with a cross-party group of MPs from minority backgrounds speaking in support of the country's vaccination programme. This was important in a climate of vaccination take-up amongst minorities is lower than it should be, and really welcome in a kind of bad-tempered political climate to see this kind of cross-party collaboration. The video didn't, however, feature the current Equalities Minister, Kemi Badenoch. So a young writer from the Huffington Post, Nadine Wright, who often writes about race, emailed Badenoch's office to ask why. This is a perfectly normal interaction between a minister and a correspondent who covers the beat. It should be something that's dealt with via spokespeople or directly. But what happened instead is that the minister used her public Twitter account to publish screenshots of the emails, along with a quite sustained attack on Nadine, commenting that she was sowing distrust by making up claims that I refused to take part in the video campaign, and said chasing clicks like this is irresponsible, and that it was creepy and bizarre to fixate on who didn't participate in the video. She then said on Twitter that she had not taken part in this video because she was participating in a vaccine trial. This was just the answer to the question that Nadine had emailed her to ask. It would have been a perfectly simple transaction to have answered in this email. The Cabinet Office later said that the tweets were not from an official government account, and so not something that the government formally investigate or look into. Now, we can have a whole other lecture on personal and public social media accounts, but one thing we do know from all our research is that public rarely stop to look at the difference between personal and official accounts of public figures. If someone who has a platform uses that platform to encourage a pile on of a journalist, it will have real world consequences for that journalist, whichever account it comes from. And that's something that everyone, I think, needs to bear in mind. My voice is about to go, so I'm going to take a pause there. But I also just want to say thank you so much. And I'm very, very happy to take questions with that as well. You're on mute, Sophie. I can't hear you.
Sorry. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you, Meera, and some really chilling figures there about the number of journalists who've lost their lives. It's just awful to hear that. We have had plenty of questions come in. Thank you very much to those who've put questions in, and do please keep them coming. We've got our first one here from Michelle Sanders. Thank you, Michelle, for that. How do you balance freedom of speech, maintaining journalists' desires to uncover and report on problems, and preventing journalists from confusing their consumers by having headline-grabbing sound bites that provoke unnecessarily or provide inaccurate accounts?
Thank you. That is a really good question. It flips it on its head and says, what responsibility do journalists have in this space as well? I don't think there is an immediate clash between journalistic freedom and freedom of expression. The two do exist. There are problems with how headlines work and how things play out on social media. And I think the news industry is only beginning to realize that when you write a story and you write a headline, and that headline appears on Facebook or on Twitter or on Instagram, sometimes that's all people read. So you cannot assume at all that a headline will take you, will provide part of the story and it's acceptable then to provide context and qualifiers later down. You need to make sure that the headline does absolutely reflect the sense of the spirit of the story.
Thank you. We have another question here from Mostin Laffer. Thank you, Mostin. Do you see the power of surveillance capitalism, either directly or indirectly, as a player in journalistic freedom? And if so, how? And Mostin has provided an explanation of surveillance capitalism, popularized by Professor Zuboff in her recent book, Surveillance Capital, relates to the power of big tech to collect behavioral data from users and hence monetize this information to predict or influence behavior of users. Yeah,
this is Shoshana Zuboff's book on surveillance capitalism. There's two issues to this, I think. There's one which is to do with the finances of the journalism industry, which is that the platform companies have essentially taken the advertising money and the advertising spend that used to go to the media. So if you wanted to reach, if you're a staircase builder and you wanted to reach middle-aged people in the home counties aged between 40 and 50 who might be renovating their home, you might think, well, let me put an advert in the Daily Telegraph or the Times. Now Facebook will come and say, we can tell you exactly where they are. We can tell you when they're reading your, we can tell you how many people are going to click on you. We can tell you exactly who has looked for builders in the last year. We can be very precise in the information we give you. Pay us instead. And as an advertiser, the advertiser goes, yeah, great. Now there's two, so the issue there is, should the tech platforms be allowed to collect data on you? Should you give this data about yourself to the tech platforms, and should they then be allowed to pass it on to third parties? This is a conversation about privacy and data and big tech that's still going. There's no easy answer. I think one thing again is that everyone should be aware of what information they're placing in the public space when they use these companies. The other issue about this is to do with, I think, to do with algorithms and this idea of, are you being fed news that keeps you in a filter bubble or an echo chamber? If you read one story, does Facebook decide you are the kind of person who would like this kind of stories, and therefore on your feed, you get fed more news stories along the same lines, and that stops you getting a wider view of the world. Now, there's quite a lot of, that's basically called an echo chamber. There's quite a lot of evidence to show that filter bubbles and echo chambers don't really exist online any more than they exist in the real world. So we all build our own echo chambers. We all know there are certain people we like to see, there are certain programs we like to watch, there are certain newspapers we like to read. That is the bubble we form ourselves. There's no real evidence that the online space makes that worse. Basically, you are not being restricted to your reading. If your reading habits are restricted, it's because you're restricting them yourselves, not because the platform companies are. But the issue of ad spend and the idea that a lot of money is going away from journalism to these tech platform companies because they have better surveillance of their users than any news organization would dare to have is an issue.
Thanks, Meera. We've got another question here from Tor Christopherson. Thank you, Tor. Do you think the increased nationalism is taking hold in the population and in journalism, or will it return to the way it was before the pandemic?
I would argue that it was already getting quite nationalistic before the pandemic. In Britain, we've gone through this horrible Brexit debate. I don't think that's going to end a kind of a national conversation anytime soon. I think there's a while to go because we're still at the stage of vaccine rollouts, borders being closed between countries, very cautious levels of international travel, the naming of vaccines by their national identity, the Britain variant, the Brazilian variant, the South African variant, are not helpful in this matter. So I think the nationalism in this kind of reporting is here to stay for a bit longer, sadly.
Thank you. We've got another question here from Professor Stephen Go. Thank you, Steve. Given that anyone can be a journalist these days, self-styled, biased and pseudo-journalists, how do we balance freedom, regulation and accountability?
Anyone can be a journalist, and on one hand, that is an issue, that is a problem because that doesn't you don't necessarily have the kind of the editorial and the editorial framework and a news editor to kind of mark your work. On the flip side, anyone can be a journalist, and that can actually be really good. So you have a lot of countries, communities that had no access to the kind of mainstream media, being able to set up their own platforms, their own news outlets, their own blogging platforms to speak to each other and to the world. So I think the idea that journalism is something more people can do is not inherently bad. Accountability, there are national laws against libel and hate speech and anything else you might consider, promoting laws, which can always be used against individuals and against news organizations, and very frequently are. So I kind of know what you're saying, but I don't think the fact that more people are reporting or kind of writing about their experiences is necessarily a problem. I think that the established and the legacy media do have a big responsibility to take themselves very seriously. To first of all say, are the right people journalists? Are we truly diverse enough? Are we truly hiring the kind of people we need to be hiring? And are we being responsible? Are we making it clear what's fact and what's opinion? Are we making sure we don't exaggerate stories or that we're unfair to certain sections of society when we report? I think that's where the kind of accountability and the problems may lie.
Thanks, Meera. Next question from Mark Olu. It appears censorship was at an all-time high during the pandemic. What's your assessment of the media's performance generally in stemming misinformation related to COVID-19? Do you agree most media houses got carried away by the big story at some point?
I think misinformation is a really important issue and a complex one, because it's not just a media story. Misinformation partly comes from the top. So it partly comes from the Brazilian president or the president of Madagascar speaking about dodgy remedies or denying COVID. And then part of it comes from bad faith actors, just people who are trolls, who are malicious, who are trying to sow distrust for their own either financial or personal or political gain. It's not something that inherently comes from journalism, I think, but then there's the issue of what should journalists do about it? Now, there's a long question of what do you do if the misinformation comes from the top? So if your president tells you that drinking bleach is a solution, what do you do? Do you report his words? Or do you try to put disclaimers, or do you pretend that was never said? Again, bearing in mind what I said earlier about the fact that people might only read a headline or part of a story. So do you even by repeating a lie, do you make it worse? concept of misinformation, I mean, you know, Mark, that journalists have been talking about this for ages. There's a lot of kind of fact-checking initiatives and a lot of explanatory journalism that has happened in this last year, where the media organizations had tried to say, we know there's a lot of misinformation, but instead of rebutting every single fact, we are just going to try and provide you with data sets and graphs and kind of clear facts that you can believe in. But it's a bit of an ongoing battle. And to be honest, as a journalist, if you decide that fighting misinformation is your goal, you could spend all day doing that and not get any actual kind of investigative journalism done as well.
Thank you. We have another question from Bearmat Talent. The media industry took a huge financial hit last year due to the pandemic. Journalists were laid off, freelance assignments cut, newsrooms strive for cutting expenses. What effect do you think this has had on press freedom?
Yeah, it's a huge one, and I don't know. We're still working. I mean, there was emergency funding routes set up to just get some money to journalists in the journalism in the immediate months in the pandemic, and it's a sticking plaster, and it's a really worrying trend. The impacts it has on press freedom, I think the key thing, which I said earlier, is about lawsuits. I think the threat of legal action or actual legal action can be truly debilitating to journalists. And you see in Poland, Gazeta Wyborcza, for example, is fighting so many lawsuits that are essentially nuisance lawsuits. The government might not, or the people bringing the cases might not have a chance of winning, know that they don't have a chance of winning, but they bring these lawsuits to wear publication down financially. And in this kind of, when this publication has already been running out of money because of the pandemic and all the other trends in journalism, this is a very, very effective tactic. And I think it's a really dangerous one, really dangerous trend.
We've got plenty of time for more questions. If anybody has anything else to put to Meera, we've got plenty of time left. So here we go. We've got one more. Thank you. This is from Ravi Sreen. Thank you, Ravi. India launched its COVID vaccination phase for general public yesterday. Gigantic effort. The media immediately attacked the ill-prepared. Within 3 hours, they'd backtracked. I would have expected a more supportive attitude than confusing the public. Should the media appreciate the government's effort rather than starting a blame game? The speaker criticised PM Modi without appreciating.
Well, I don't think it's the media's job to be appreciative or cheerleader. I think there is something to be said about what kind of journalism is helpful to its readers, to their readers. And I think what you see in a lot of countries is everything is seen as a prism of politics. So a vaccination rollout is seen as a win for the government and a loss for the opposition, or ditto, a mistake is seen as a win for the opposition and a loss for the government. And that's not really what a lot of readers or viewers, what people want. What they want to know is, where can I get my vaccine rollout? Is it effective? Is it going to kill me? You know, which is the best medicine? So I think there is something about whether journalists and journalism should frame questions in a way that's kind of positive and negative for individual politicians, when actually for the public it's more an issue of how is this going to affect me. But in terms of whether they should be kind of uncritical, I don't think that's what you ask journalists to do.
Thank you. We have another question here from Ian Hines, which I apologise, Ian, I missed it earlier in the chat, sorry. Is it wise for journalists to squabble amongst themselves? The profession is being attacked from all sides. Would it not be wise to circle the wagons and support one another?
God, yes. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's one of the biggest dangers to journalism at the moment is kind of the squabbling. I did some research last year before the pandemic. So it was a report that was published in January 2020, where I looked at press freedom in Central and East Europe. And I did a survey of journalists in the region, asking them about attacks and where the most vicious attacks came from and which attacks hurt the most. And so the attacks came from politicians, from Russian trolls, this was Central Europe, and from other journalists. And they said by far the attacks that they felt most keenly were the ones that came from other journalists. Those were the attacks that kept them awake at night, made them truly distressed, affected the way they did their job. And also when you said what would help, what would give you strength, what they really, everybody said solidarity from other journalists in my country. So not from foreign governments, not from media organizations in other countries, but other journalists in your country. And I think this is absolutely key, absolutely, the kind of solidarity between journalists and several, again, a lot of governments have kind of played on this. So in Turkey, Erdogan's government has very much kind of played one set of media organizations off against each other. And ultimately, they've all ended up the losers because they all end up with severe constraints on how they can operate. So yeah, absolutely, it's a real problem. And also kind of a fairly low cost solution to the problem. It's right there, stop doing it.
We have another question here. Can Meera tell us about the digital deep dives where they're working with the press to prepare for coverage of the COVID vaccine rollout? What are some of the common problems they face?
Misinformation. So last week, the Reuters Institute, we ran a digital deep dive, which involves various academics from Oxford University and a group of journalists, not the Journalist Fellows, another group of journalists around the world. And the idea was a day to speak about vaccine rollout coverage. I'm just going to think for a moment the key problems. The issues we faced were misinformation. So absolutely, how do you combat misinformation? And in particular, misinformation and fear of the vaccines that was circulating on platforms, on Facebook especially, amongst minority communities. And this goes back to the original issue someone raised about diversity in journalism. A lot of these communities do not feel represented by the mainstream media, so they ignore it. They then create their own platforms on Facebook. And some of the journalism that happens on these platforms can be very good, but there's also a lot of misinformation on these platforms, especially relating to vaccines rollout. And there's been a real issue of how can journalists and governments in this instance, both who have the similar aim, reach these communities on these platforms, win their trust, and pass over the kind of accurate, timely information on vaccine rollouts that's really critical at the moment.
Another question from Andre Avorio. Thank you, Andre. What is the most fundamental change to journalism that can be attributed to the rise of the internet as our primary mean to consume news? And how does that relate to press freedom more broadly?
I think the biggest change is that all our news is on this. It's on a mobile phone. So we've gone from newspapers sat at the breakfast table. We've gone from sitting all together after dinner to watching the 9 o'clock news, to watching TV, to everybody, so kind of big shared experiences. They're either shared with the people you live with your family, or they're shared because you all consume the same thing at the same time in the same format. So you all sit down and watch news together, or most people read a morning newspaper. So we've gone from kind of shared experience of news delivered as a package to a very individual, personalized, atomized experience of news. So we all look at our phones at different times in very short snippets. The amount of time we spend on news is staggeringly low compared to how much time we spend online altogether. So I think it's the fight for attention for people's time, and the fact that the news is no longer a shared kind of coherent experience is the biggest change overall.
Thank you. Our next question is from Christine Francisco. Thank you, Christine. With the vaccine rollouts, how do you think the press freedom this year or next year will start while we start exiting the pandemic, probably in terms of government pressure or misinformation?
I don't know. I mean, that would be easy to say, but I don't really know. I think a lot depends on the state in which governments exit the pandemic, because the tendency to attack the press when you're weak as government is very strong. So I think governments that have been hit very badly financially, that have lost popularity, have been seen as having had mismanaged the pandemic, will in turn lash out at the press. But I also think there's a lot of governments that, depending on how the vaccine rollout goes, might feel that this is a moment for a kind of new conversation about how society is run, and this is again something that ideally, in an ideal world, could happen with journalism. But I think a lot depends. It's hard to give a kind of global overview. So I think a lot depends on the state of the government as we exit the pandemic, how strong they are economically and politically.
Thank you. I'm just keeping an eye on time. We've got another 10 minutes or so. We have got lots of questions coming in. The next one's from Peter Erdely. Apologies if I haven't pronounced that. Thank you, Peter. When it comes to the availability of reliable public health information, do you think the big social media platforms helped or hurt the situation on balance?
Good. Peter's from Hungary, so that's kind of convinced. I don't know if you, this is going to be like a fake answer, but I don't know if you can talk about helping or hurting. They're just there. They're part of the ecosystem now. So I think, they have played their part. I think they were slow to recognize how much misinformation was swirling about on their platforms, and very slow and far too reluctant to take things down. But they have also been crucially important in reaching certain communities as well, and also have provided a lifeline to many people in lockdown. We have all been sat at home, and the social media platforms have been our only way of communicating with friends and family in many cases. So they've played a really functional role, but I think they were very slow to address misinformation spreading on the platforms. But having said that, like I said, again, talk about minorities. Peter, you remember we had Sinead Boucher from New Zealand's newspaper group Stuff come to speak at the Reuters Institute last week. And she works with one of New Zealand's biggest media houses, and they actively took their content off Facebook because they were unhappy with the relationship with Facebook. And it didn't hit their revenues, it didn't really hit their reach, but it hit their ability to reach the Maori community who were on Facebook. So there was this one recognizable area where there was real value in being on Facebook, but not everything.
Thank you. We have, our next question is from Melva Izquierdo. In countries like Nicaragua, we struggle with gathering official numbers of the real COVID situation in the country. Back in the civil unrest in 2018, we also didn't have the numbers of people killed or imprisoned, and the total count wasn't official until the international organizations did the official investigations. In your experience, what have you found useful practices when reporting in countries where the information from the government doesn't exist?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And Denise Leavesley, the former principal of GTC, has spoken about this at length. What's not counted is as important as what is counted. And what we don't count in society gives us a sense of what we prioritize in society. So when you don't count the number of women who die in childbirth, for example, you're kind of giving a fair indication of where you consider them on the priority list. So as journalists, there's kind of two strategies, three actually. The first is be open about what data is not available and ask questions about why. Why have we not been looking at this? Could we start looking at this, please? The second thing is to build up relationships with statisticians and experts who might have data that they can't necessarily make public, might have gathered for their own research or for other research, or companies that might have gathered data for commercial reasons that might be of use to you, if you can persuade them to share it with you. And the third one, which you know well, Malva, is to crowdsource, to try in some cases to get the data yourself. That's again an area where social media can be tremendously useful, because you can put out calls for information that is not 100% reliable and might not be completely comparative data, but can be useful in itself sometimes to tell certain stories.
Thank you. The next question is from Rachel Chitra. What would you say about the work of English medium journalists versus vernacular journalists in countries like India? There was this case in Bangalore where Rachel works, where journalist Gauri Lankesh was shot at point blank range, 8 bullets to her head. One of the takeaways of her death was because of the direct connection of the vernacular press. She was in more danger than English medium journalists. Sorry if I hadn't read that clearly.
Yes, no, I mean, I think this is kind of talking about what data we collect. I think the threats that local language journalists face is massively underreported because we just don't hear about them. So I think it's a huge problem. I don't know what the solution is. I mean, I think local language journalism, especially in India, is in many ways one of the big growth areas. I know that if you look at, where big tech companies want to grow, it's local language voice media in densely populated countries like India, because they think it's an underserved market that has tremendous potential for growth. But without well-resourced news organizations with lawyers and a budget for security to protect the journalists working in these areas, they are vulnerable. And this is something that does need to be discussed. You're absolutely right.
Thank you. We have another question here from Bernardo Peredo Videa. Thank you for joining us, Bernardo. How could media freedom be strengthened to promote democracy even in democratic countries where the media is under attack in the pandemic, i.e. the US and Brazil?
Yeah, I think this is where the kind of pact between journalists and society and the rest of us really, really matters. I think journalists in these countries have often been very slow and reluctant to speak about themselves, to speak about the threats they face, to speak about the pressures on them, because you don't want to become the story. You always want to be reporting on the story. But sometimes I think it's worth being open with people about the fact that it's coming under attack, and also rethinking the relationship with the audience. And this is again a kind of possibly another lecture altogether, but thinking, what's journalism for? Why should people defend us? Why should they pay for us? Why should they think that we are on their side as people? And why, so you don't get these accusations that you're part of the elite thrown at you. Would you get thrown at you as a journalist even while the elite are attacking you for being unprincipled and amoral and unpatriotic? But you can be attacked from both sides. You can be accused of being part of the elite and then be attacked by the elite themselves. So I think if you're in that situation, you kind of have to say to the public, we understand you and we're on your side. And to do that, you do need good reporting, good storytelling, making sure everyone's voices are heard, and make sure you're kind of telling the stories that are about people's lives, that it's not being done for other reasons, to please an owner or to boost your own career, but to genuinely help the people you're serving.
Thank you. I'm very aware that you've been talking for a solid hour now, Meera, and you must be exhausted. So I think we're going to put our final question to you. Again, this is from Tor Christofferson. Thank you, Tor. Do you think journalism has been strongly put back this period because we've been less mobile, and it's also been difficult to work together in physical teams and larger projects with investigative journalism?
I mean, yes, in one way, I think we've been put back massively financially, and well, we all know that we'd much rather be together in person. I do think there's been a lot of innovation in this space this year. So a lot of digital transformation that we've been talking about as an industry for years has just happened overnight because there was no choice. And one very concrete manifestation of that, I think, is not requiring everyone to go into a newsroom in London. So you can hire somebody in Birmingham or in Manchester. I'm looking at a very UK-centric view, but you can hire people outside the big urban capital and still have them report and do a daily job because suddenly the technology is there and we're willing to use it. It's always been there, but we've not been willing to use it. But I think the financials of journalism have received a very, very severe setback that's going to take a long time to recover from. And that in itself will have ongoing consequences, I think, on resourcing and what kind of stories or what kind of innovation we can afford to do.
Thank you. I think you've probably all noticed that we have put a link into the Reuters Institute. And Meera, if you just want to say a couple of words about the Wednesday seminars.
Yes, absolutely. So on Wednesdays at 1 o'clock, I chair a seminar called the Global Journalism Seminar, which is normally at Green Templeton College and is now in cyberspace. And it's with senior editors and journalists from around the world. We have Rebella from Zeta magazine in Mexico speaking this Wednesday. It's free to join, free to sign up. You just sign up via the link that Sophie's put on the website. And it'd be really lovely to see you there because we do get some really terrific speakers and terrific conversations.
Lovely. Well, on that note, I would like to say thank you so much, Meera, for a really fascinating lecture and for answering so many questions. It's been quite eye-opening, I think, for me as well. And I want to thank everybody who came today, all of you for submitting your questions. And we will be sending you the recording link so you have the opportunity to watch again. On the same page, you'll also be able to find this term's lectures. We're busy planning our lectures for next term, so do look out in your inboxes for news of those. And we hope to see you all at some point after Easter at one of our lectures. But in the meantime, stay well, and we'll see you after the Easter break. Thank you.